Yeah, hello. My name is Frank Federico. I live in Sydney, Australia. My profession is teaching, specifically history teaching. So although I was raised as a young boy as a Catholic, by the age of 14, 15, I started to have a lot of questions about what I had been taught. And I was at Catholic schools and I would ask my teachers various questions about the Bible and why we should believe the things that we were being taught, and I would ask my parents as well. The more that I found that these questions weren't getting answered, particularly in relation to issues concerning science and faith, I felt that the beliefs that I'd been told were grounded in superstition and not evidence. For those intellectual reasons, I started to turn away from believing. But there was also, I think, a volitional reason. I think that as I was getting older, I was getting more influenced by my peers rather than my parents and by the culture around me. And then my own desires sort of led me away from a faith that was constraining me from doing the things that I wanted to do. So basically by the age of 16, I think I'd really turned away from my faith. My parents couldn't force me to go to church anymore, and I was quite hostile to it. And by the time I got to university, I was very hostile to it and really didn't want to engage in issues related to religion. Circumstances led me to change my mind. I was actually running a school camp back in 1997, and I was looking for some staff to come with me on this camp. In the end, I was forced to take a young first-year out teacher whose name was David. I did so very reluctantly because all I knew about this guy was that he was a Christian, and such was my hostility to Christianity that I didn't actually want him to come, but in desperation, I had to take him. I ended up boarding the last bus going to this camp. There were 3 buses. The first 2 had gone. I ended up joining the last bus, and when I got on that bus, to my disappointment, the only seat left on the bus was next to this guy, David. So I had to sit with him. I had to converse with him because the bus trip was about an hour. And after sort of like 5 minutes of pleasantries, asking him about how he found the school and how he's finding teaching, I was not left with much else. So the one thing I knew about this guy was that he was a Christian and a science teacher, and in my head that didn't make any sense. So I started questioning him about that and asked him about how he could reconcile his faith with his knowledge of science, because for me, as I mentioned earlier, they were incompatible. And this began a 50-minute conversation where I would bombard him with these kinds of questions, trying to get him to explain how he could believe in these kinds of things, which in my head were irrational. Yet here I was talking to someone who clearly was not irrational, someone who clearly was intelligent, and for whom the science-faith issue was not a problem. And for the first time in my life, I met someone who was actually able to answer questions, someone who clearly was intelligent and had some grounds for explaining why he believed what he believed. And further to that, some of the things that I thought was wrong with Christianity, he agreed. And so I wasn't aware of the sort of like the difference between denominations. This was the first time I'd met a Protestant believer. Hearing a different perspective on what Christians believe, and recognizing that not all Christians agreed with certain aspects of the faith and the institutional church, which were problems for me. Furthermore, we got to share a room on this camp, which I didn't want either, but that happened too, and so we had further conversations. And what happened in this meeting was that for the first time I met a Christian that I liked. The very next week, I was in a reading club for history nerds like me. The book of the month just happened to be, for that particular month, a book called Jesus the Evidence. And I would never have contemplated looking at that book or buying that book if I hadn't had that chat with David. So when I purchased this book, I thought that I would be able to find little evidence. And much to my surprise, I found things that, as a teacher and a student of history, I was quite amazed by. Things that actually made it plausible to believe that Christianity was actually true. And I used to have this presupposition that Christians had a faith that was not grounded in evidence. But what I found in this text was actually it's the other way around. There's actually evidence, and then people's faith follows from that. Evidence first, faith later. And that surprised me. And the kind of evidence I was finding in this book were things like the early nature of the sources that were included in the New Testament. So my understanding or my pre-belief was that the stories about Jesus, I did believe Jesus existed, but the stories were written centuries after him, or they were myths that evolved over time. But instead, this book told me the sources are actually very early, that they were actually written within the lifetime of people who actually knew Jesus. Furthermore, there are lots of these sources. So I used to think of the Bible as a solitary source, but that's a wrong way of thinking about it. There was no Bible when these Gospels were written or when these letters were written. They were just later collected and put into one source for convenience's sake, but originally they were independent of one another. That really surprised me, the quantity of the sources and then the quality of the sources. Like, this is unparalleled in ancient history. You just don't get so many sources about an individual so early. They are in agreement about the fundamentals of who Jesus is, including the supernatural aspects of who he is. So the miracle stories, the fact that he was crucified, they all agree about that, the location of his burial site, and then most importantly, they all agree that he was physically raised from the dead. All these things, including archaeological evidence as well, which also confirms so many of the historical details in the texts, from place names to locations. The archaeology is often very confirmatory of what we find in those texts. So this was like a cumulative, overwhelming case for the reliability of the New Testament that really surprised me and made me take Christian claims more seriously. And I started reading the Bible as well. That was another thing I started to do because I wanted to investigate the sources for myself. So the more I read of the Bible, particularly the book of Acts is where I started, I just had so many questions. And thankfully I had someone who was willing to sit and listen to me and have a go at answering them. As I became more convinced by that evidence, and I recognised what was being said in these texts, it started to move me. And the message of Christianity is a wonderful message. It's a really beautiful message. It's a message that says that all human beings have inherent dignity because God has deliberately and purposely made us. And he loves us so much that he would willingly suffer and die on a cross for our sake. I had never encountered this message of grace, of unmerited forgiveness. I was quite overwhelmed by that. The fact that Jesus forgives me unconditionally, that he died and suffered on a cross for me while I was still a sinner, that he didn't wait for me to be perfect. This was a profound teaching that I just had no idea about. I always believed that I had to do things to earn God's favour, but what the Bible actually teaches is that God favours me already. So spiritually, that was a beautiful thing to believe, but I had the further grounding that it's actually rooted in truth, that it's rooted in history. My behaviours in many ways changed. Some of them would take longer to change, but initially there was a radical change, and this upset my friends because I no longer wanted to go to the places and do the things that we had been doing for a long time. Although I would still go along, my heart wasn't in it, and they could see this change. And my friendships basically sort of started drifting away, and they were just never the same again. On the other hand, I just developed this incredible desire to know more about God. This thirst for knowledge about God, tell me more. I kept meeting with David. We didn't just stop there once I became a Christian, but we continued, and we still meet once a week and talk about things, including things about God. I was fortunate enough to join a church where the minister recognised that I had this kind of desire for more knowledge, so he gave me a study Bible, but he also put me onto a course for lay people that was available through Moore Theological College in Sydney, which basically covered a lot of the fundamentals of Christianity, all kinds of angles. And I lapped that up. I loved doing that. It wasn't a high-level academic course, but it was suitable for me while I was working. The thing is that the more I learn about the things of God, the more there is to learn. But for me, it's the most important thing to know, because if God exists, there is no greater topic to know about. If eternity is real, then I want to know everything about getting there. I want to know everything about how other people can get there. I guess I would encourage skeptics to question their own assumptions. Don't just go with the flow of culture or go with the flow of your peers or what your family tells you. Christians often get accused of that. You know, we're brought up in Christian homes, that's why we're Christians. Well, I think the opposite applies. If you're brought up in an atheist home, the likelihood is that you're going to be an atheist too. That doesn't mean that either belief is right. So work it out, go investigate. And another thing I would say is, when it comes to Christianity, I had so many presuppositions that were wrong. So for the skeptic who's watching this, do you also have those presuppositions too? How do you know what you know about Christianity? I would encourage you to go to the sources, look at the evidence that's plentiful and work it out for yourself. Does the evidence stack up? You might conclude that it doesn't. But unless you've actually looked at the evidence first, you're not actually in a position to make that judgment. Don't judge Christianity by looking at other Christians, because the thing is, all Christians are flawed people. And the thing is, what makes a Christian different from a non-Christian is that most Christians recognize that. That's why they go to Jesus, because they need his forgiveness for their flaws. Those flaws don't just stop, they continue. And that's been a great frustration for me. I think initially when I became a Christian, I expected to be, perfect instantly and all these things would stop. That hasn't been my experience. I need to go back to Jesus, but the good news is that he'll forgive me. So please, as a skeptic, don't judge Christianity by Christians. Yes, there'll be Christian hypocrites. I'm a Christian hypocrite. I do things that I don't think we should be doing. I try to change. It's not easy. Most Christians are in that position. So go to Jesus. Go to the sources. There you will find what authentic Christianity is meant to be about. And then hopefully you'll meet a Christian like I did, an intelligent, humble, thoughtful, extremely patient individual who'll sit with you and go through the kinds of questions you might have.